So moving on to what is transformative really is the volunteer experience. So it can be good, bad, or indifferent. And Yasmin and Carol can talk much better than I can about when it wasn't terrific, because we're human and our school systems are busy places, and sometimes the matches are not made that, like, we didn't make a good marriage of the volunteer and the supervising staff. But even that is a learning experience for us, for the participant, for the staff person. But what happens is as if all that talking and those, interaction at the training stage suddenly comes together into this transformative moment when they go out there and they do it. And as I can't remember her name now, who said, I'm sick of all the paperwork. I just need to get on with it. I need to do. And that's the truth. They need to do. And often that's the frustration as a new immigrant. You don't get to do. You have it here. You just get to do it. So it had so many ways of changing them. So they came back transformed from when they left us in November. They had moved along the continuum of integration, like Mach speed, right? It wasn't just this slow. They just whoosh. So the worry, of course, for us is that they're now here, they've got the momentum, and now what? So what, right? That's the sad part about programs that have, an end. But it really is, I can't say enough about the value of the volunteer experience. And all the research shows that volunteerism is one of the key elements, probably the most key element for social integration. And this is a very, I don't expect you to be able to read this, so I'll read it to you. Actually, I was going to hand it out. The question of ethnic civic engagement is a growing issue in Canada's major cities. There's a variance in rates and levels of voluntary sector participation as a function of ethnicity. So certain ethnic groups have different attitudes, norms, and barriers about engaging in volunteer activities. And if that is the case, they systematically move outside of the sort of larger cultural context. So there's a real issue that some cultural groups do not, A, think it's of value to volunteer, or there's actually a negative value to volunteerism, or there's a distrust of institutions that volunteer if they come from societies where civic institutions were actually the bad guys as opposed to us who are the good guys, right? They wouldn't want to go within 10 miles of a school or a hospital or anything like that. But basically, the research says that where you have active civic participation, you have a much higher level of social integration in any of those groups that produces a sort of social volunteerism. So as a society, we have to be aware that this has many implications. So I'm going to talk a little bit about volunteerism as a Canadian cultural value. Now, our new Governor General, one of his 3 priorities was volunteering. In Canada, we have the second highest volunteer rate in the world. However, that's about to change because we have contributed 1 billion hours of unpaid volunteer time in Canada. And those are, most of that, probably 80% of that is contributed by the super volunteers that do it all. And if you work in a volunteer organization, even when you were a parent, there was always those people who were there all the time, and then there were the people that were hardly ever there. What's going to happen in a very near future is that those people are not going to be there any longer. And who is going to take their place? It's not going to be the baby boomers in all likelihood, because the trends seem to indicate the baby boomers are not going to be volunteering. They're going to be off having an enriched life somewhere, as all baby boomers want to do. Basically, the population that's coming in to fill our spots are people from another country. So what are we going to do about this? This is a significant social issue, I think. One of the things that I found fascinating in my research, which I haven't written here, is that that there was such a distinct, you make assumptions as a Canadian that, oh, volunteerism is good, and everybody volunteers, and I've always volunteered, and da-da-da-da, and then I realized that, oh, well, in some societies, no way would they ever volunteer, because it would be seen as a sign of like they couldn't get a job. They weren't valuable enough to be paid or whatever. So that whole thing is an issue for us that we need to address, because pretty soon the volunteer fire departments, the people driving Meals for Wheels, they're not going to do that unless we look at volunteerism in a different way. So one of the things that I address in the manual is that basically we have to change the way we treat our volunteers. And interestingly enough, and I'm going to pat ourselves on the back, but when I looked at best practices for volunteers and best practices for newcomer volunteers, didn't I find that the way we were implementing the Vision Project was a best practice? Because what happened is we did the training, we gave them a finite time, task, so we prepared them. So they were going to have success, right? They weren't just going to sort of go there and feel incompetent or unloved. They were going to have success. They were going to have connections. They were going to have a defined time. Someone was going to come and check up with them. Somebody was going to help them make their connection, their contact as effortless as possible. And at the end of it, they were going to get a certificate. They were going to get something that was worthwhile, that would help them go forward, something concrete, which they all got today. But I don't think that's how volunteers are generally treated in the larger connection. And I think over time that's going to have to change, and that actually our volunteer program could be a real model for that. But what happens is sometimes second generation or third generation Canadians are often assimilated, but they don't know that. But that's kind of what happens. And the further you are from the first generation, the more likely it is to be assimilation. So I see that in my children's friends who they are amazingly worldly. They have all the aspects of that. Then you have the people who not only do not value their cultural identity, in some way they feel that their identity is wrong, but they also don't feel connected to the Canadian identity, and so they become very marginalized. So they don't feel valued, they feel in a defensive role, and they basically become sort of in these in sort of encampments, which is the last thing you want. So this is one of the models that we have to work with to help people be aware of where they're going. And one of the things that we did in the workshops is we talked about the cultural attitudes of each country. And I don't know if any of you know about Hofstede and Swartz, and about their cultural profiles, about the distance between authority. So in China and the Philippines and Iran, the hierarchy is very important, and the distance between the boss and the person at the bottom is big. And the power differential is really important. So in Canada, that it's not. It's like this. So imagine if you come from a place where you have to be very deferential to the boss, and all of a sudden you come here and the boss is called Bob, That's a big paradigmatic shift. And one of the things that people say about Canadians is the Canadians are cold. And I remember in one of our conversations, somebody said, oh, there was snow, and I asked my neighbor, who was Canadian, if I could help him clean his driveway. And he said, no. And the man was crushed. He said, well, why would he say no to me helping him? And he said, Canadians are cold. But in actual fact, in Canada, we have one of the highest national values on individualism. So we don't really embrace collective activity. So it felt personal, though, to the man who was offering to clear the driveway. So there's all that sort of understanding that some of what you experience is not about you, it's your cultural fishbowl that you've come from, and that you move to another one, and it seems like it's a personal slap, but it is not. So, that's another thing I think that we haven't really addressed, and it was I guess maybe it's a learning for me, that I didn't know that somebody had spent all this time talking about how dissimilar certain cultures are to the Canadian culture, and why that makes it more difficult to access them and to make them work more effectively together. So that's kind of it. I've talked